Boa tarde a todas e a todos. Começo agradecendo a presença de todos os que estão aqui nos prestigiando, agradecendo em nome da FIESP, dar as boas-vindas ao nosso workshop Desbloqueando Fluxos Confiáveis de Dados entre a União Europeia e o Mercosul, realizado em parceria com a representação da Delegação da União Europeia no Brasil e a Agência Alemã de Cooperação Internacional, a GIZ. Aproveito a oportunidade também para cumprimentar primeiramente a embaixadora da União Europeia no Brasil, Marian Schwegraf, Maria Bustgan, conselheira da representação da União Europeia no Brasil, que nos prestigia aqui pela quase última semana no Brasil, fechando com chave de ouro este ciclo, o cônsul-geral do Paraguai, Luiz Fernando Avalos Jiménez, a cônsul-geral do Uruguai, Maria Noel Reis, e a cônsul-geral da Hungria, Susana Laszlo. Bom, para a FIESP é uma satisfação sediar uma vez mais essa oportunidade de diálogo bilateral entre o Brasil e a União Europeia, reafirmando esse espaço de aproximação entre o setor produtivo, formuladores de políticas públicas e parceiros internacionais. Essa nossa conversa de hoje é uma continuidade do que nós já iniciamos em relação à parte de dados em janeiro deste ano, quando tivemos a honra de receber aqui na FIESP o comissário europeu Michael McGrath, um dia depois da assinatura, em conjunto com o vice-presidente da República do Brasil, Geraldo Alckmin, do reconhecimento mútuo entre Brasil e União Europeia dos regimes de proteção de dados pessoais. Na realidade, de uma forma mais ampla, essa agenda bilateral Brasil e União Europeia tem uma longa história aqui na FIESP. Nós temos muito orgulho de fazer parte de mais um marco como esse. Esse avanço, desde janeiro, na parte de dados especificamente, é resultado de uma convergência construída ao longo dos últimos anos, em que tanto o Brasil quanto a União Europeia compartilham o compromisso com elevados padrões de proteção de dados. Cada parte aqui com a sua respectiva regulação, legislação. Aqui no Brasil nós temos a LGPD, a Lei Geral de Proteção de Dados, e, no caso da União Europeia, o Regulamento Geral de Proteção de Dados, o GDPR, dois marcos que são considerados globalmente referências internacional em governança e proteção de direitos. A partir dessa convergência regulatória, nós temos uma oportunidade de aprimorar ainda mais a segurança jurídica e a previsibilidade e, com isso, aumentar o fluxo de comércio e investimentos entre Brasil e União Europeia. Importante lembrar que, hoje em dia, nesse mercado digital, os dados são tão ou mais relevantes do que o comércio de bens, serviços e fluxo de capitais. Então, é fundamental que ocorra não só a proteção desses dados, mas também essa convergência regulatória para justamente fomentar essa troca internacional entre parceiros estratégicos como o Brasil e a União Europeia. Lembrando ainda que nós temos a sorte de estar num momento histórico com a celebração do Acordo do Mercosul e União Europeia, que justamente ampliam essa parceria estratégica entre o Brasil e a União Europeia, e seguramente esse marco de convergência regulatória pode fomentar ainda mais o fluxo de dados, investimentos e comércio. Então, esse contexto de aprofundamento de cooperação regulatória em temas digitais, ele complementa uma agenda comercial e econômica que aqui na FIESP nós temos essa honra de fazer parte com o apoio da Embaixada aqui da União Europeia, do GIZ também, dos nossos parceiros aqui presentes. E lembrando que esses mecanismos eles são fundamentais para os próximos passos, ou seja, nós já atingimos grandes conquistas com essa convergência celebrada em janeiro. Hoje, no workshop, a ideia é que daremos um seguinte passo e que sejam alguns de muitos que virão, que nós continuemos trabalhando nessa direção. Então, tenha certeza de que os debates do nosso workshop aqui hoje, agradeço de novo a presença de vocês, eles vão contribuir para esses próximos passos. E, mais uma vez, agradecendo a presença e passando a palavra para a embaixadora Marian, da Delegação da União Europeia.
Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon, boa tarde, and thank you for being here with us this beautiful afternoon. It's a great pleasure to join Jacqueline Lopez from the FIESP side in welcoming you all to this workshop on unlocking trusted EU-Mercosur data flows. This event builds on our shared commitment agreed with FIESP during the meeting we held here with Commissioner McGrath to engage the private sector on opportunities and practical implications of data governance and international data transfers. Since the provisional start of implementation of the EU-Mercosur agreement, the importance of trusted data flows has only increased. In this context, adequacy decisions on data protection regimes play a central role in ensuring that companies and citizens of both sides of the Atlantic can benefit fully from closer economic integration while maintaining high standards of privacy and trust. Evidence supports this approach. I always like to highlight what European Commission analyses show about adequacy decisions, recognizing that a partner country ensures a level of data protection essentially equivalent to that of the European Union. Such decisions can increase digital trade by between 6 and 14%. And this is remarkable, and for this reason we are here together to really achieve the maximum benefit possible. Today's discussion is therefore both timely and forward-looking. To ensure broad access to these insights, the first part of this workshop will be recorded and made available on the website of the EU delegation to Brazil, so that all interested organizations and companies in the whole country can see how they can reduce administrative burden and increase the benefits of that agreement, because one needs to know how to do that best. We are all very pleased to have about today leading experts from both the EU and Brazil to guide us through these issues. I would like to extend our sincere thanks to FIESP for hosting us, to ANPD and in particular Director Miriam Wimmer for her participation today, but also for her tremendous role in the adoption of the adequacy decision in Brazil. And to the colleagues from the European Commission, DG Just, for example, for their continuous support and engagement. Not to forget to thank the presence of the General Consuls of Uruguay and Paraguay to highlight the Mercosur connection. Including, of course, all colleagues assembled here in this room today, and above all, also the participants of the private sector and the civil society for contributing to this dialogue. I wish you all a very productive and engaging discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. Oh, sorry. Good afternoon. My name is Julia Rosa. I'll be moderating our discussion this afternoon. Just a few comments on housekeeping before we continue. First of all, I would like to thank you, FIESP, for all the work and for organizing the logistical parts and also hosting us here today. On the agenda, we now have 4 speeches from experts. So we're going to start online with David, who is already online. After that, we have Miriam Wimmer from ANPD. Then we have Dolores Dozo, our expert from EU on data protection. She is actually arriving now from the airport, so she will join us in a little bit if you see someone coming in. And then we have Bruno Bioni to wrap up this section. This is the part that will be recorded, and after that we'll start a roundtable and discussion. I have a few questions that will guide the discussion, but also feel free to raise your hands. I'll call you, and then you can pose a question to our experts. The idea is to have an open debate and to clarify some of the issues that were highlighted already. This is also in the context of 2 consultancies. We are through GIZ. GIZ is a German agency for cooperation. We are collecting inputs for 2 consultancies that will be ongoing throughout this year. One on business opportunities for after the data adequacy decision. So we're hoping to gather input from the private sector for this consultancy. You can share here your insights, but also if you have an interest on sharing this afterwards with us, you can reach out to me bilaterally or to Gabriel, my colleague over there, and we'll be sure to include your inputs on this consultancy. And the other consultancy is on the impact on digital because of the Mercosur agreement. It's still a very mysterious topic, so we are hoping to gather some insights and see what kind of outputs can we have from the EU-Mercosur agreement. Other than that, I will just pass the floor so that we can continue and stay on time. So, David, please.
Good afternoon, dear colleagues, Your Excellency, dear consulates, dear hosts. It's a pleasure to be with you today and provide a close overview of the regulatory aspects which have led to the adoption of the mutual adequacy decisions. Indeed, in my next 10 minutes, I intend to map out 4 main topics. First of all, I'll provide the regulatory overview as laid down by the General Data Protection Regulation, by the GDPR, therefore an overview of what the law contains. Secondly, I will zoom into the adequacy decision, therefore how the adequacy reflects what is provided in the GDPR. Thirdly, I will discuss the effects of the adequacy. I will focus mostly on business, on the positive impacts of the adequacy for businesses, but also address some wider issues for civil society and the citizens in general. And finally, I will close by looking at the next steps after we having successfully concluded this adequacy decision. Therefore, before even getting to these 4 steps, I think through the introductions which have been made, it is clear that today data flows are essential for the global economy. Digital barriers, digital borders are harmful. It's important that data flows freely and safely. And that is indeed the objective of the Commission when it reaches out to fulfill and conclude adequacy decisions. It is also a clear figure and a big figure, the fact that thanks to the mutual adequacy decisions, the area of free and safe data flows nowadays between the EU and Brazil combines up to 670 million consumers. Therefore, what we have done in January is indeed the concentration of two different legal orders merging together, understanding each other, speaking to each other, to make sure that data can flow freely and safely among 670 consumers. Of course, as I will explain later on, the scope is wide and therefore the benefits reach throughout the different parts of society. Let me now start by looking at the regulatory overview. Therefore, the first point I mentioned in the introduction. How have we reached the decision of Brazil being an adequate country. I will not bore you with what the GDPR says in Article 45. I will just inform you that there are different tools with which the EU legal order can transfer data. The most comprehensible and the most fulfilling one is indeed the adequacy decision. Therefore, through an adequacy decision, data can flow freely and safely without any additional conditions. Therefore, it is the sort of golden standard, the highest level possible, which allows exchange of free flow of data between the two different legal orders. When we are assessing any third country, we look at the rule of law, the respect for human rights. We also go into deeply into the different legal orders. And this is where I want to start by extremely praising our colleagues from ANPD, especially Miriam, with whom we have exchanged throughout the past years and especially last few months of last year extensively, where there was extremely dialogue, where both of us were converging to make sure that what was at the beginning a discussion ended up with a like-minded situation. Therefore, this is the first time throughout my short intervention where I will be indeed praising the ANPD and the Brazil in general for such a good and sterling work. So cooperation when we are doing a regulatory overview of a third country is extremely important. And luckily for the Commission, we found a strong and collaborative person in Miriam in throughout our exchanges. Another important point is indeed to make sure that the third country has an independent data protection authority. Therefore, it is very important that the data protection authority is indeed independent. We also look more broadly into the international commitments the third country has. Therefore, if I were to put these three things in a basket, these are the constitutional requirements, the beginning of any adequacy with any third country needs to have these basic ingredients. They have to be respect of rule of law, human rights, there has to be an independent data protection authority, and indeed, throughout the process, the ANPD obtained an even higher status, the highest status within the EU, within the Brazilian legal order, which shows the commitment towards having a truly independent data protection authority. Therefore, the constitutional requirements laid down by the GDPR are extremely important when the Commission begins and enters into dialogue. Of course, after making sure from the Commission that there's an assessment, there are other internal European procedures which are important, but which I will not bore you with them. But indeed, what I want to emphasize here is that there is indeed a high and detailed scrutiny of the level of data protection in the third country, since an adequacy decision has a binding effect on all the 27 member states, on all their different public authorities, and on all the 27 data protection authorities. Therefore, it is a very important decision by the European Commission. Therefore, it has to be posed on strong foundations. After having provided this general framework, I will now zoom into what the Brazil adequacy really means. So the question would be, how have we translated the rules of the GDPR concretely in the case for Brazil? Indeed, the independence of the data protection authority was indeed highlighted before, and it is extremely important and is a key feature in the adequacy decision. You have all read it, and I will not bore you with all the details, but just to let you know that there was an extensive look into the constitutional framework of Brazil, the data protection framework, the case law. We looked into the definitions of the data protection rules in Brazil, concepts, principles, legal grounds. Therefore, it was a very thorough examination, because at the end of the day, what we were looking was indeed that the Brazilian data protection framework is essentially equivalent to that of the EU. And indeed, that was the decision of the Commission, shared by the European Data Protection Board and the 27 member states. And this is why now, in the perspective of the EU, the Brazil's legal order is indeed is indeed adequate. Therefore, if I were to use a non-legal topic, it has the golden standard. Of course, this is really nice and a bit bureaucratic, but at the basis of all this is our shared conviction, both on the side of the EU and on the side of Brazil, that the protection of personal data is not a barrier to trade, but the very foundation of a sustainable digital economy. Therefore, at the basis of all this, there is a shared conviction that there's a shared conviction, there's commonality of legal orders, where we talk to each other and indeed came up with the result that data can flow freely from one side to the other. Indeed, our conviction was so big on both sides that the adequacy has the broadest scope, the widest scope. What does this mean? It means that it covers not only private companies, but also researchers, business, and citizens. Therefore, the scope of application, the free flow of data, is not only concentrated to one sector, to the commercial sector, but it is broader and includes researchers and public authority. So this is, I think, an example, demonstration of the importance of this commonality, which was mentioned in the introduction and now which I am emphasizing. If we move to the third part, what are the benefits? So I think this is the most important part for everyone, at least in the audience. What does tangibly an adequacy decision mean for industry? What does it mean for the citizen? And what does it mean for civil society? Of course, and as has mentioned before, the visit of the commissioner came right after the signature of the Mercosur. So there's a broader dimension to the dimension of the adequacy decision per se. Therefore, the adequacy is an accelerator of indeed the Mercosur agreement. I also would like to point out that there is also a network effect. What does this mean? The EU has different adequacy decisions. There are decisions with Argentina, with Uruguay, but also with other third countries. Brazil can send data to Argentina, to Uruguay, to Andorra, which is another member state, which is another third country that has adequacy, to the UK, so data can flow freely between the different adequate countries, and this is the network effect. Therefore, thanks to this adequacy decisions, which the Commission has bilaterally signed, each of them can now transfer data freely and safely. So this is also an important point, which is not always emphasized, but which is important to keep in mind, this network effect. Now, if we zoom into the benefits of the adequacy decision for businesses, it adds efficiency and reduces costs. Why? First of all, data between a company in, let's say, in São Paulo and a company in Rome needs no specific authorization. Therefore, data can flow freely. Therefore, businesses are saving costs. The need of appropriate safeguards like tools, which are called binding corporate rules, standard contextual clauses, therefore, special agreements or special legal texts to allow for the transfer of data are no longer needed. Therefore, indeed, this means tangibly that there are less legal fees, and at the same time, there is more legal certainty because through the adequacy, data can flow freely. If I then maybe during the roundtable, we can zoom into other real benefits for the different sectors. So we can speak about, for example, in the finance and payments, there is easier customer due diligence, fraud monitoring. So there are other concrete effects, but maybe this we can also discuss when we get to the roundtable, where we can be even more specific on the precise benefits of adequacy. Of course, there are also benefits for the citizens, and in the sense that the data, once it lands in the third country, is protected. So the level of protection between the two different legal orders is the same, therefore redress mechanisms. Therefore, if the personal data, if the citizen believes that his data has been breached, the level of redress is the same. Therefore, the citizens' data protection, high level of data protection in the EU, is also mirrored in the third country. So indeed, this brings the element of trust, which is also important for citizens and also for companies. Of course, in the broader dimension, in the relationships between the EU and Brazil, having adequacy means that Brazil is a trusted partner. Therefore, there is regulatory convergence, and this facilitates trade. Therefore, this is another concrete example in the three different levels: businesses, citizens, and the broader picture for the EU and Brazil in general. At this point, I think it makes more sense now to look forward. So I get to the last point and my conclusion, next steps. In fact, these next steps can be divided into two. The formal ones, which indeed there is ongoing discussion always with the ANPD and through different tools, which I will mention later. And also the adequacy decision itself singles out that there will be constant monitoring and that a review will take place within 4 years. But indeed, immediately after January, there has been continuous discussion between the Commission and the ANPD. For example, a delegation was indeed at the Commission premises a few weeks after the adequacy, where we met and we discussed. Wherever in Convention 108, together the ANPD, we sit around the same table, and the OECD, the same thing. And indeed, there is also administrative arrangement on online minor protection, which again shows the convergence between Brazil and the EU. And indeed, this sort of close fertilization of the legal orders is another example manifested on minor online protection, where the ANPD, with its avant-garde, or let's say compared to the EU, advanced the regulatory powers, is indeed helping the EU or understanding the EU what possible means and ways can be done. So much so that in the next few days, there will be a delegation from Brazil visiting the Commission, indeed, to discuss online minor protection. Therefore, what do I want to say? What do I want to mean is that there has been a convergence right after the adequacy decision, and indeed this continues to manifest itself in data protection strictly, but also in other areas, such as online minor protection, which has a big element of protection of data, but also has a broader dimension. I also would like to recall also that the Commission has this adequacy network. So it is a network which groups all the different countries which have an adequacy status, and Brazil for the first time will be invited for the next meeting, which will take place probably in November. And this continues to underline the close collaboration between Brazil and the EU. At this stage, I think I'll give the floor back to the host. Thank you very much. Muito obrigado. Thank you.
Thank you, David, especially because it's 8 p.m. So thank you for changing your dinner for us. I'll now pass the floor to Miriam Wimmer.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much, Julia. I'd like to express my appreciation to the European Commission and to FIESP for this very kind invitation. It's indeed a pleasure to share the table with so many distinguished speakers and friends. I noticed that Dolores has just arrived. Very nice to see you again, Dolores. And indeed, it's a pleasure to sit down here today to discuss international data transfers, which, as David mentioned, is a key aspect when we look at our digital economy, since data flows are in fact the blood that flows in the veins of our highly interconnected society. So when we discuss international data transfers, I think from the perspective of a data protection authority, the main issue, as David highlighted, is in fact trust, right? So we have a very robust legal framework here in Brazil to protect personal data, and our effort is to make sure that data is allowed to flow across borders while retaining the same level of protection it would have if it were actually processed here in Brazil. So this is one of the fundamental pillars of modern data protection laws. And in fact, different countries have adopted different approaches to deal with this dilemma. So if we look at the GDPR, as David was saying, there are several mechanisms such as standard contractual clauses, binding corporate rules. But I think, as David mentioned, adequacy decisions are perhaps the golden standard, right? So if a different country is recognized as being adequate, this means that its legislation is substantially equivalent to that of Europe or vice versa, to that of Brazil. And this means that data can flow across borders without any additional bureaucracy. So this is something that is, I think, very important when we look at the business community, because, of course, we realize that many of the mechanisms that we have nowadays, such as standard contractual clauses or binding corporate rules, do entail a certain level of bureaucracy in terms of compliance, right? So in our own regulation here in Brazil, under the LGPD, we also have this broad set of mechanisms, these contractual mechanisms such as SCCs, BCRs, also other legal provisions such as consent, fulfillment of contracts, international cooperation arrangements, and so on. But undoubtedly, when we look at adequacy decisions, they are perhaps the broadest mechanism we may have to promote international data flows. So, as all of you are aware, LGPD is still a fairly young set of legislation. Although it was approved in 2018, it entered into force only in 2020, which is the same year when ANPD was created. And as a commissioner, I can say that since the very beginning, we were aware of the importance of this topic. So the issue of international data transfers was part of our very first regulatory agenda that was in place from 2020 to 2022. And subsequently, it was included in the other regulatory agendas while the work was underway. So our regulatory process on this topic began in 2022 with a public call for contributions that included a number of open questions on international data transfers. And at that point, 4 years ago, we were trying to understand what the main barriers were to international data transfers and which mechanisms would be most appropriate for us to focus on as a first approach. In August 2023, we published a draft regulation for public consultation, and in fact, we had a quite remarkable response with over 2,000 contributions from stakeholders across different sectors and also internationally. So we had contributions from the business community, from civil society, from international organizations or international think tanks as well. And this was in fact very helpful for us to understand what we should focus on in our own regulation and in our own regulatory efforts. So the final regulation was approved in August 2024. And here an interesting side note is that when we first began working on this regulation, we were focused almost entirely on the so-called contractual mechanisms, standard contractual clauses, binding corporate rules. And throughout the process, we realized that it would be very important for us also to include some provisions on adequacy decisions. And of course, at this point, our negotiations with the European Commission were already underway. So we have, as Dolores knows, as many colleagues here know, had a very long-standing cooperation since the beginning, since ANPD was created. And as we were working on a regulation, and also as the ANPD was gaining more independence, a more robust structure, it began to seem more feasible for us actually to reach this mutual adequacy decision. And so we decided to include in our regulation also some provisions on how we should work to find another country or organization to be adequate. Of course, the LGPD also provides for some criteria, but we felt it was necessary to provide further detail in our regulation. And in fact, when it was approved in August 2023, it contained provisions not only on standard contractual clauses, which are still, I think, a very important mechanism, a very simple mechanism, off the shelf, so to say, that large and small organizations can apply, but we also included rules on how to find an adequacy decision. I think when we discuss adequacy decisions, and here focusing perhaps with more detail on the mutual adequacy decisions, it's important to mention that from our perspective, this is always a two-way relationship. Of course, a country can unilaterally find another one adequate. This is possible. But our regulation, I think, very clearly places an emphasis on reciprocity. So we mentioned, for example, that ANPD should prioritize the assessment of jurisdictions that offer reciprocal treatment to Brazil, and also where adequacy recognition can help expand the free flow of personal data. So I think when we look at the international scenario, this chessboard of international relationships, I think that the very strong relationship we've had with the European Union for many, many years made this a natural partner for our first adequacy decision. And this is due not only to the similarity of our legislation, but also because of the many opportunities that we felt would be opened if this adequacy decision was found. So when we actually examine another country or jurisdiction for adequacy, we're not only focusing on the existence of identical legal rules, which would be in fact very difficult, but more definitely on the idea of substantial equivalence. So we want to see if the same logic of protection is present, if we have strong institutions, if we have mechanisms that can safeguard individual rights, even if the data is no longer in Brazil. So when we finally reach our adequacy decision, I think this was a moment of great celebration, not only for us at ANPD, but also, I think, nationally. And in fact, some of you may have followed this event, but we had a very nice ceremony at the Presidential Palace with the acting President Geraldo Alckmin present, Commissioner McGrath. So I think it was very symbolic of this strong cooperation that we have developed over these years, especially since Maria has been with us over the past 3.5 years. And I think that the mutual adequacy decision reinforces something that we already know, that Europe is one of Brazil's most important trade and investment partners, but also that we have many commonalities when we think of legal frameworks and core values that drive our respective societies. So an adequacy decision has a series of benefits for businesses, but also for individuals. Of course, from the individual standpoint, it means his or her data is protected regardless if it is in Brazil or in Europe. But also for businesses, I think the advantages are very clear. To begin with, lower compliance costs, right? So if there is no adequacy decision, this means that a business that wishes to transfer data internationally needs to have or specific contracts or a specific legal basis or to incorporate standard contractual clauses into their arrangements, even if these are transfers within the same economic group. So in a highly globalized environment as we have today, this in fact raises costs and makes things more bureaucratic. So you need more lawyers, and who needs more lawyers, right? So the idea of an adequacy decision is to lower costs, reduce compliance costs, but also bring greater legal certainty, to facilitate cross-border trade and digital services, and also, I think, to increase opportunities for collaboration, for innovation, and for research between our respective jurisdictions. So these benefits, I think, are important for different sectors of our society, but particularly for those sectors that rely very heavily on international data flows, such as finance, telecommunications, cloud services, healthcare, digital platforms, and also if we look at the growing field of artificial intelligence, this is also something that is certainly impacted by an adequacy decision. Finally, I think that there are 2 points I'd like to make. The first one, concluding, is that for us, this mutual adequacy decision is also, I think, an important landmark in terms of celebrating how far Brazil's privacy framework has evolved since it was introduced very recently, right? So our legislation is not yet 6 years in force, and many of you have accompanied ANPD's creation, firstly as a small body connected to the Presidency of the Republic, but now finally as a regulatory agency with the highest possible legal status of independence and technical autonomy. But also, I think, the recognition of how robust our legal framework is and how far Brazil has come institutionally in terms of creating the necessary safeguards to the point where the European Commission and the European Parliament, all the European bodies involved in an adequacy decision, can, without further comment, unanimously recognize that our institutional structure is sufficiently robust so as to merit an adequacy decision. So I do say that it's important to recognize that over the past few years, Brazil has demonstrated a very strong commitment to data protection through the development of our regulation, through enforcement actions, through international engagement, but also through open dialogue with stakeholders, both domestically and internationally. The final point I'd like to make is the following. David was mentioning the network effect, the fact that we have now many countries or jurisdictions that have a somewhat like-minded approach. And I think this, in fact, leads us to the discussion of the importance of international cooperation, especially regional cooperation. And I note that we have here authorities representing different countries from our region. And I think that Brazil occupies a particularly interesting position in the international scenario, in the international privacy landscape, because on one hand we have a legal framework inspired by European principles, but of course with our own Brazilian flavor. And at the same time, Brazil actively participates in different networks and different spaces of data protection, including Convention 108+. Brazil is now formally in the process of joining this convention. The Ibero-American Data Protection Network, the network of Portuguese-speaking data protection authorities, and of course we also participate in the Global Privacy Assembly, OECD, as well as other international spaces and organizations. And I do feel that this unique and this special position that Brazil occupies, also as a country that is recognized as adequate by the European Commission, allows us to serve as a bridge between different regulatory traditions and approaches, and to contribute to discussions on global interoperability. So of course, global harmonization is something that is perhaps not feasible because each country will have their own approach, their own specific needs. But when we discuss interoperability, certainly adequacy decisions are a very important mechanism, and one that Brazil wishes to continue exploring with other countries that may perhaps already have adequacy decisions from the European Commission that somehow work along the same substantive principles and views, even though our language, our legislation may be slightly different. So I think I'd like to pause at this point. David finished his comments discussing the issue of trusted partners. Brazil is a trusted partner, and I think this is in fact a very nice concept for us to work on. So from our side, we are also very happy to mention the European Union as a trusted partner, and to express our desire to continue cooperating and engaging not only on this topic but also on others, as we were mentioning, child online protection, issues related to online platforms, for instance. So I feel there is, in fact, a large field for us to continue exploring. Thank you very much for the invitation.
Thank you, Miriam. As someone who is not a lawyer, but someone from international relations, I think it's very exciting how this cooperation, data adequacy, it's an example of international cooperation, a concrete one. So very interesting. Look forward to seeing what comes next. So I'll pass on to Dolores, who has just arrived. Thank you.
Hi, thank you. Okay, so sorry for being late. And I know that you were expecting somebody else, but okay, so big shoes to fill, but I'll do my best. So, okay, so the significance of this EU-Brazil mutual adequacy arrangement cannot be overstated, nor the efforts and work that has been carried out by the NDPD in less than 6 years, as Miriam said. But what does it mean in practical terms, an adequacy arrangement? It means that data can move now freely between the European Union and Brazil, easily as it moves from Munich to Barcelona, from São Paulo to whatever city in the European Union. So adequacy is much more than data transfers. It's about trust. If I should translate what this mutual adequacy arrangement is, I would say that an adequacy arrangement is an assessment of trust to find another on who you can trust. Trust between governments, between business, between regulators, and between citizens and the services and goods they use every day. So I know that many of you have already spoken, so I will not repeat all the classic terms, but I would like to complement some reflections, basically on what adequacy means, why the EU-Brazil mutual adequacy arrangement matters, what concrete benefit brings to business, investors, and consumers, its importance from a geopolitical perspective, as Miria recalled, and finally, how it can become a platform for deeper cooperation amongst regulators and increasing the dialogue between the EU and Brazil and beyond. So, what is an adequacy finding? A finding of trust. Once you got that, you understand that it doesn't mean that the regimes needs to be identical. No one is looking for identical regimes, but you are looking for similar level of protection. It's a formal, in terms of practical meaning, is a formal determination from a certain state or jurisdiction that grants similar level of protection than the one that you have at home. And so forth, because of that protection, you now can move data freely from one jurisdiction to the other. So adequacy removes one of the most important regulatory barriers to international exchanges. This is particularly important because data has become the backbone of modern economy. Financial services, cloud computing, artificial intelligence, logistical, digital health, e-commerce, manufacturing, everything relies on data. All depends on the ability to move data from one barrier to another, to one border to the other. How efficiently and securely. Before adequacy, data flows, before this arrangement, data flows needed a compliance cost and a compliance effort from businesses and operators that were implementing additional safeguards and implementing one data transfer mechanism such as SCCs, standard contractor clauses, or whatever mechanism that was in place. So today, these safeguards, not the safeguard, but these mechanisms, SCCs or whatever tool you were using, are no longer required. Any Brazilian company, regardless of its size, its type of activity, its business model, can freely transfer data abroad to another European Union member state without having to comply with all these additional requirements that are mandatory for any other country. This brings me to concrete benefits of adequacy. Adequacy does for data what trade agreements does for goods and services. It removes friction, it reduces transactional costs, it reduces the time and loops of contracting cycles, simplifies compliance designs, compliance programs worldwide. It creates predictability or legal security, and improves and strengthens market access to new markets. So, adequacy transforms one compliance cost, compliance effort, into integrated business operation. And this strengthens investor confidence in data-intensive business models. These are tangible benefits that affect day-to-day business activity. A Brazilian software company serving European customers can now operate with fewer transfer-related compliance burdens. And because the arrangement is mutual, the same is true for any European company transferring data to Brazil. The advantages of adequacy are particularly significant when, as in this case, the two jurisdictions have also concluded a free trade agreement. I'm talking about the Mercosur agreement, which has entered provisionally, is provisionally applicable since May 1st, 2026. As I said, trade agreements reduce barriers for the movement of goods and services, and adequacy reduces barriers to the movement of data. Therefore, those two instruments, adequacy and a trade agreement, are very complementary. And since most exchanges today rely to a greater or less extent on the processing and transfer of data, the mutual adequacy arrangement has the potential to amplify significantly the benefits generated by the trade agreement itself. However, I believe the significance of this arrangement goes beyond operational efficiency and trade facilitation. It has also an important geopolitical dimension, as Miriam said, this bridge that she was referring to. At a time when many actors are increasingly challenging the very ideas of multilateralism, international cooperation, and open markets, this EU-Brazil mutual adequacy arrangement demonstrates that regulatory convergence remains possible and is worth pursuing. It sends a powerful message regionally, but also beyond, demonstrating that different legal systems, although they are different, they are preserving the differences, but they can learn from each other, they can work together, build on shared and common values, and develop mutual and beneficial tools for both. The mutual agreement is, indeed, as Miriam also said, is the result of a long period, long work, a long process of collaboration and mutual influence between the European Union and Brazil that has unfolded over many years, from the influence of Marco Civil Internet, where it has influenced the GDPR, to then the GDPR being an influence to the LGBT. And then, I mean, this type of mutual influence will continue, as for instance now with the new prerogatives that were granted to the NDPD on minors and how they need to be, all the prerogatives on how minors will be, needs to be taken care in the digital environment. Those are things that are currently being discussed in the European Union, and those are tangible topics where both can find mutual benefits. So these adequacy arrangements are about choices, political choices made by Brazil and the EU in the last decade. The choice to embrace the immense opportunities created by technological revolution, while recognizing the digital economy also needed rules, clear rules of the game, and those rules needed to be the human at the center and rights at the center. And it's that choice that brings together Brazil, the EU, and other members of the adequacy network that also David was referring. The adequacy network or the adequacy club are those countries that were recognized already by the European Commission as adequate, as Argentina, Brazil, Japan, Switzerland, New Zealand, UK, the United States, Canada, South Korea, and more. The fact that a major international player such as Brazil has joined this club reinforces the message that strong privacy protections and economic growth are not competing objectives, can go hand to hand and be mutually reinforcing. Seen from that perspective, the mutual adequacy arrangement carries a significance that goes well beyond data transfers. It demonstrates that digital governance does not have to be a choice between laissez-faire and digital authoritarianism. There is another option, a third way: innovation with trust, openness with safeguards, digital transformation grounded in rights and democratic values. Another aspect when considering the broader significance of this mutual adequacy arrangement is that its effects extend beyond Europe. Many jurisdictions that are adequate for the Commission, like the Commission has granted an adequacy decision, such as Argentina or Uruguay, use the list of countries that are adequate from the European Union to assess, under their own current legislation, to assess whether a third country has or not an adequate level of protection. This is called like the adequacy list. So how it operates. If the European Commission recognizes Brazil, for instance, as an adequate jurisdiction, then Argentina also recognizes Brazil as an adequate jurisdiction. Why? Because is like a transitivity. If A is equal B, if Brazil is equal the European Commission, the European Union, and the European Union is equal Argentina, then Brazil is equal Argentina. So this is a multiplier effect, meaning that whenever you have an adequacy finding, it not only applies or it has effects within the jurisdictions that are involved, but also in Japan, also in other jurisdictions that are also recognized as adequate by the Commission. As a result, this mutual adequacy arrangement has the potential to enable data flows not only between Brazil and Europe, but also regionally, first of all, among Mercosur countries. In that respect, it will be interesting to see whether in the future the Commission will assess if other countries from Latin America are adequate based on these criteria, such as Chile or Colombia. We know that Chile has modernized their data protection regulation in a very convergent way to the Brazilian LGBT and to the European Union. So it would be interesting to see whether the Commission in the future would decide also that Chile or Colombia, who has also trying to modernize its framework for a long time now, once it's also recognized. And in my view, I think that this mutual adequacy arrangement can be like a thriving activity, that it can boost the more adequacy arrangements that involves Latin American economy, shaping the future of trusted data flows regionally, not only bilaterally between Brazil and the European Union. This is also a good illustration of how domestic reforms, regional integration, and convergence around global standards can complement and reinforce one another. But adequacy is not only about economics and geopolitics. It's first of all about rights. The mutual adequacy arrangement was only possible because the European Union and Brazil converged around a number of fundamental principles. In other words, this adequacy is not just a piece of paper. It's deeply rooted in fundamental policy choices and legal approaches adopted by both systems over many years, first of all in their domestic frameworks. This is ultimately what lawyers say hard law, convergence around accountability for organizations handling personal data, enforceable rights for individuals, independent supervision, and effective redress. And that matters a lot for the long-term solidity of the mutual adequacy arrangement as a credible and legal certain transfer mechanisms for business and individuals. In other words, data can move freely because rights travel with it. This is perhaps the most important message of all. Free flow of data is not achieved by lowering standards. It's achieved by building trust through high standards. And trust is what makes deeper cooperation possible. And that brings me to the last point I wanted to mention. Adequacy should not be viewed as an endpoint. By being reciprocal and by covering both the private and public sectors, the mutual adequacy arrangement creates the conditions for a quite uniquely ambitious model of cooperation in the digital age. And we have already seen evidence of this. A few months ago, the EU and Brazil concluded an agreement on cooperation with Europol, which is the EU's law enforcement agency. This agreement enables the exchange of operational data between Europol and Brazilian law enforcement authorities. Brazil is the first Latin American country to conclude such an agreement with the European Union, and we may see another very soon. I understand that the European Union and Brazil are working to reinforce its dialogue and on covering a broad range of issues of mutual interest, from artificial intelligence, e-signatures, to the protection of minors online. Given the new responsibilities to ANPD on protection of children and adolescents in the digital environment, ANPD could bring enormous contributions to the EU-Brazil dialogue. In my view, this development would be welcome, as one of the things that happened the most amongst adequate countries is the lack of communication and cooperation amongst DPAs, amongst data protection authorities. I therefore wonder whether over time there may be a scope for structured forms of cooperation between NPD and the European Data Protection Board, which brings together all European data protection authorities. This could concern, for example, enforcement cooperation, the development of compliance tools, regulatory sandboxes, guidelines, cooperation on specific topics. After all, NPD and all the European Union data protection authorities interpret and enforce laws that share many concepts and face similar challenges and face similar questions every day. And ultimately, those are the institutions that are giving practical effect to adequacy arrangements. Deeper cooperation between DPAs could therefore benefit both individuals and businesses by promoting greater coherence, predictability, and consistency in the application of similar data protection laws across different jurisdictions. And once again, given the weight of Brazil and the increasingly leading role played by NPD in the privacy regulators community, this may become a catalyst for wider convergence between Mercosur and Latin America and the EU, as well as across the region and the Americas. So, well, I think I will stop now, and I'm open to continue, but I think I'll stop now. Thank you.
Thank you, Dolores. Okay, so for our final speaker, I'll call Bruno Bioni, who is sitting next to me. Bruno, you have the floor.
Thank you, Julia. So I'd like to thank you for the kind invitation. It's a great honor to be here with you, Miriam, also Dolores. Dolores, I always remember, I think 8 years ago, that we were sitting at the Global Privacy Assembly with Danilo Doneda and then Giancarelli, and we were talking about if Brazil would be able to pass a comprehensive data protection law, and we did, and now we are talking about mutual adequacy decision. It's like such achievement in a really short period for us and also for our trustful partnership. And I would like to highlight this because, as Miriam highlighted before, also Dolores and also David, I think the mutual adequacy decision right now is not only a great partnership between EU and Brazil, but also a great geopolitical message for the entire world that is possible to push for economic growth, also by protecting fundamental rights. Because what we are seeing right now with different tensions between Brazil, United States, but other countries, is how we will be able to push for innovation, to push for economic growth, but without or by protecting fundamental rights. So just to give a clear example, Brazil is under the investigation of breaking Section 318 by United States. We are following the news. PIX is under attack. But at the beginning of the investigation, Brazil was also being investigated if there was somehow illegitimate commercial practice by putting somehow barriers for international data transfer. My organization, Data Privacy Brazil, we contribute in this public consultation by the Department of the Commerce of the United States, and we say clearly it's not like illegitimate, but it's make even possible to foster international agreement, international data transfer by protecting, by finding some adequacy decisions that recognize that some different countries are trustful partners by protecting, collaborating with fundamental rights protection. So just to give you a clear example that the topic that we are discussing right now had some kind of consequence in the middle of this process, in the meaning of this process. Second, I would like to highlight also somehow critical reflections, because as Dolores highlighted before, adequacy decision is not like a permanent status. It's not like an end point, but is a dynamic evaluation of how those two countries, those two trustful partners can grow and evaluate and give and find and reach an evolution together. Both countries highlighted that it's necessary to continue monitoring in 4 years from now to 2030, how the both countries, how the both partners are not only keep and maintaining the level of equivalency, but also how they can reach better, reach greater. And here, one specific point is very, very important for the civil society and even academia. Brazil does not have a comprehensive data protection law on law enforcement. We don't have a criminal LGPD. This is recognized by the EU adequacy decision. This is also recognized by the Brazilian Data Protection Authority decision. And from now, our Congress is still keeping paralyzed this discussion, even though we have a draft bill that was proposed 3-4 years ago. So one thing that must be interest to monitor if Brazil will be possible or able to push this discussion in the National Congress in order to have a comprehensive data protection law on law enforcement. Otherwise, we are not going to have the same level of adequacy, because European Union does have that kind of legislation and advancement in this legislative and regulatory framework. Even though, as Miriam highlighted before, Brazil right now is discussing the adherency of Convention 108 Plus. This is being great. This is going to be great because Convention 108, the scope of Convention 108 covers not only commercial use of personal data protection, treatment process, but also data processing activities with regards law enforcement. So somehow this monitoring 4 years evaluation could push not only Brazil at the domestic level, but also at the international level in that regard. The second point that I'd like to highlight is that, okay, we have an equivalency measurement between the trustful partners, but as Miriam highlighted before, Brazil is somehow, let's say, the beginner of the game in terms of legislative evolution, advancement, and also in terms of institutional architecture for the enforcement of the law. So one thing that is key to evaluate for the next 4 years is going to be if the Brazilian Data Protection Authority will have institutional capacity to enforce in a more effective way the Brazilian data protection law. So just to give you a concrete example. So now the Brazilian Data Protection Authority is advancing in its regulatory agenda, but so far we were not able to advance in a very basic regulatory agenda, which is data rights. The data subject rights is under the evaluation and is under the waiting process in order to have a more hard law in that specific area. And this is very, very important right now in Brazil, because somehow frauds, this frauds epidemia here in Brazil is somehow consequence of violating data protection data subject rights, such as the data subject rights to be aware of who is processing their own personal data. So this is also somehow a very, very important moment to not only monitoring the consequence of this agreement, not only from international level, but also domestic level. The third point that I would like to highlight as well is that, as Dolores highlighted before, adequacy decision is not one-way exercise, but a bi-direction exercise. And one important thing that the Brazilian Data Protection Authority highlighted in this decision is that Brazil should following carefully how European Union is advancing the so-called digital omnibus. There are some worrying movements with regards the weakening of the General Data Protection Regulation, which could affect somehow the level of equivalence between Brazil and the European Union. More precisely, one question that we are following very closely is the discussion about the changing of personal data concept in the EU regulation on data protection and other issues that we should also monitoring carefully. Last but not least, as Miriam highlighted as well, our Brazilian Data Protection Authorities is, let's say, teenager institution in this game. We are advancing very fastly, but how the Brazilian Data Protection Authority will have greater capacity by combining not only the Brazilian Comprehensive Data Protection Law, but with two other important issues that were recently somehow in the same basket of the Brazilian Data Protection Authority, which is the enforcement of the Brazilian Children Digital Act, which somehow deals with content moderation, and also the recent decrease on Marco Civil of the Internet Bill of Rights, that also gives some new mandatory, some new regulatory rules for the Brazilian Data Protection Authority. I'm saying this because the Brazilian Data Protection Authority should keep going with this path by prioritizing the issues of comprehensive data protection law. Otherwise, we are going to be missed in this regulatory, very complex arena. And as we can see here right now, by advancing the Brazilian Data Comprehensive Law, we could not only further advance in protection of fundamental rights, but also the growing of our economy. And I would like to end with a very concrete example. This decision about the international data transfer could well position Brazil, for instance, in the so-called data centers economy, not only with regards to the European Union, but in between the other engagement network of adequacy decision members, in particularly because Brazil is very well known because of our clear energy matrix. So by combining both, Brazil could be seen as a trustful partnership, not only from the European Union, but also from these other countries that are looking for a partner in terms of data processing activities that are able to protect fundamental rights, that are able to provide energy clear matrix, and that is also possible to provide somehow legal certainty. That was another terminology and words that were used frequently, very often here in our conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Bruno. So with this, we wrap up this moment for speeches, and then we'll go to a moment of discussion. I have a couple of questions that I would like to pose for our speakers, but also it's an open floor, so please, if you would like to actually reply to one of these questions, feel free. If you have any questions, also please raise your hand and I'll call your name. Well, not your name, because I don't know your names, but I'll call you. So I think the first question is, and I'd like to thank for all these comments, has been a good mix of where we were, where we are, and what are the possibilities for the future. And I think one of the questions we've been asking ourselves is, what's the level of awareness in Brazil and in Europe of between consumers, between companies, and civil society, that this adequacy decision has happened, that what's the impact it may have, what the assessment is that you see, based maybe on other cases, or maybe based on your own experience. Please. I'm not sure if Miriam maybe or Dolores wants to.
I would like to start by addressing another thing, commenting on Bruno before, while we think about the question, which is something he said about the omnibus data protection law. We know that the European Union is now debating on maybe reforming the GDPR, but I wanted to say that the policy approach has not changed. The omnibus draft bill responds to a need that was basically gathered from SMEs, principally for them to have several articles or provisions on the GDPR to simplify the regime for SMEs. And those are the changes that are trying to be more analyzed and taken care of. But the policy itself of having robust regulation, it will not change. It has not changed, and it will not change. So now I'll
I can perhaps provide some comments, Julia. I think that's a really difficult question to answer. Firstly, because usually companies come to us when they have a problem. When everything is going well, they forget about us. So I can say we have received no complaints on the adequacy decision. And on the other hand, we have received from business organizations requests for recognition of adequacy of other jurisdictions. So I think this is actually a positive sign, because it signals that there is the understanding that adequacy decisions reduce compliance costs, facilitate trade, facilitate businesses. So I'd say this is something positive. Other than that, I think there is a challenge of raising awareness about data protection in a more global sense. So here we have a small community of experts, of businesses that are interested in the topic. But if we leave this room and go to the next room, perhaps people will not be so familiarized with this issue. So I'd say that the issue of raising awareness is perhaps more of a general challenge, not specifically related to adequacy decisions.
Thank you. Anyone else? I would also like to hear from chambers of commerce if they have had experience on this information with their associates or other partners.
And if I may, I think that adequacy decisions are always welcomed because they ensure free flow of data. And quite the contrary, what I always hear is that the Commission should recognize more adequacy, have more adequacy arrangements, rather than criticizing which were approved. So that's what I heard, at least, that they need more adequacy decisions.
Ambassador, please.
If I also may add one specific question on what is your experience with small and medium-sized companies? Do they know how to use this possibility of adequacy decisions? Does one need specific knowledge to know how to implement that? I understood that lawyers are superfluous in this whole context. I'm also a lawyer, but I freely admit to the needlessness in this context. But I wonder if there is concrete knowledge for SMEs to know to make most use out of this decision.
Claudia Barman, the German-Brazilian Chamber of Commerce, and also with Euro Chambers, the representative of the bilateral European chambers here in São Paulo in Brazil. Maybe going one question after another about the awareness on the adequacy decision. On one side, it's a bit like you said, if you don't receive complaints, it's all fine. We realize with our working groups, especially on data protection, that the companies that work actively with the legislation on, because they work on international data transfer, they have the awareness and they value the adequacy decision. We try to support them, and we know that the contact with the ANPD is really a practical one. If there are any questions or doubts, there's a short way to communicate. Certainly, awareness can be raised more still for companies, and also on the practical aspect, how you can still put that in a contract, since I'm a lawyer too, to have that within the contract, that the adequacy decision exists, and to have that clearly for both sides established within their contracts. And I think it's still important to see the tendencies that with the omnibus decision to have more simplifications even for SMEs. We have that in the local legislations. There are different regulations for SMEs, but you still see that depending on the size of the SME and they're acting within an international ambience, that they still look for even more simplified rules and orientations and model documents, because many of them don't have the infrastructure to have a lawyer or a DPO or someone dedicated to the topic. So I think a combination of more simplified rules together with models and orientation, how they can comply in a simple way, would be really useful for the companies. But certainly the adequacy is already a big step regarding not having to use the standard contractual clauses, which we even ourselves as a chamber are perceiving the simplification already. Thank you.
Excellent, thank you. Anyone else would like to bring any inputs on this question? I would, if you have any... Dolores, sorry.
No, I wanted to answer how this implemented by an SME. That's the beauty of the adequacy arrangement. You don't have to do anything because it's covered like jurisdiction to jurisdiction. So you don't have to. It's the only data transfer mechanisms where you don't have to do anything. Zero compliance cost. The only thing that you need to do is, if you want, because law is known, so you don't have to do this if you don't want to, but if you like, if you're an SME or whoever you are, you can say that the personal data will be transferred to an adequate level to a jurisdiction with an adequate level of protection. That's all. And the other thing is that I think that question about how it's implemented, it extends to every aspect of data protection. And I believe I'm a Latin American, and we do have a different level of maturity in terms of privacy than other jurisdictions, and it's a matter of privacy culture. We need to strengthen somehow. I don't know. I don't have the recipe on how. Maybe Miriam can show us or share us something. But I think that at the end of the day, we need to build up and we need to set up a higher standard of privacy culture and to invest on privacy culture and promote this regulation more vividly, because it's true that sometimes it feels more like a niche, that whoever has the access to it, because it has a law firm that can hire, well, then it complies, and whoever doesn't, then it's alone. and well, maybe the DPAs, one of the roles of the DPAs are to guide, to promote guidance and to build guidance and to assist, everyone, but especially SMEs.
Thank you. going maybe thinking of what Claudia mentioned on how to raise awareness. Oh, sorry, Gloria. I'll just finish just one point on this. If you have any other suggestions of how to raise awareness, of how to reach out to specific sectors, feel free to share with the group or bilaterally if you want. But that would be very interesting for us to hear. What kind of maybe webinars, guidebooks, or exchanges could support companies to be aware that this exists and that this is easy to do. Claudia, please.
Yes, I just would like to add that it is all about trust, right? So we are culturally different in how we trust. And I think in this direction, there's a great responsibility on the authority of the European Union also to transport what this means to the European companies, and also for the Brazilian authority to transport what this really means to the Brazilian companies so that they can build this trust. I find now it's a different topic, but it has everything to do with it, a different way how to trust in the how to make use of the preferential tariffs. I see that German companies are a lot less they don't want to risk so much as, for example, Italian companies want to. So the Italian companies are a lot faster in making use of the lower tariffs of the EU-Mercosur agreement. That's my impression. That's what I'm finding out through talking to the Italian chamber and talking to the German companies and seeing what's happening. And I think that would be a great solution to have more examples or cases and reinforce on the concrete business level what this means for a small, medium-sized company acting as a stakeholder in the international commerce between Mercosur and European Union.
Thank you. Anyone else? Please.
Good afternoon. I came here to learn, I should say, because when we received this invitation, I was a little bit lost because I have to confess I dedicated my time to consular matters, which is completely different with what I was doing in my long career. But I was the chief of the negotiation during 1 year, representing my country. I think we advanced between 2017 and 2018. We almost closed the negotiation. But as far as you know, we never at that time spoke about this issue. So I came here very curiously and tried to request from you. I just consulted a few moments ago the AI, which is the state of Paraguayan laws. And if you started to discuss this matter with our country, because I became a little bit curious and by to situation between EU and Brazil, which is so. I am here to transmit to my authorities if there is some kind of expectation that we can do in Paraguay to reach this kind of. It's very good to say the trust partner that Brazil is considered now. I think because we negotiated this agreement all together, we already have we are a trust partner in the commercial sector. So this is a special tool for all of the members. So I became even more curious to see if you have a view of what Paraguay can do, which is the situation, so that I can transmit to my authorities. That's why I'm here. Thank you.
I'll pass on if the ambassador or if anyone from the EU has any information on this. David, are you with us still? online?
Yes, I'm still here. So, first of all, it's very fascinating to see the discussion.
Yes, hello, welcome back. We can see you again.
Super. No, it's a very fascinating discussion to hear what's going on and all the questions. Maybe now that I have the floor, I can address one or two points. On the digital omnibus, indeed, there was a proposal by the European Commission, which is currently being discussed. So the text is still being elaborated, and was indeed this morning a discussion amongst ambassadors. So even the questions such as on the definition, it is still work in progress. So indeed, as Dolores said, the idea was to simplify. So the idea is to try as much as possible to modernize slightly the framework after 10 years of application, but the safeguards, the core elements remain there. With regards to the issue which Bruno mentioned on the definition, it is still work in progress, and let's see what the landing zone will be. So until now, it's a bit, from my side, merely speculative to tell you what the outcome will be. Of course, whatever changes will be made, it's important to keep this high level of data protection, because at the end of the day, an adequacy assessment is, at the end of the day, from a legal perspective, a commonality of the different legal frameworks. So I think this is on the omnibus. On the other point, on the feedback by SMEs or anyone of the Brazil and EU's mutual adequacy decisions, the feedback we get is positive. Indeed, as long as no one complains, it means that it's something which is working. So I think in general, right after the adoption, there was a good press coverage. There was also more use of it. And indeed, and I think Dolores mentioned this, one of the hard things when an adequacy is done is to measure it. Therefore, how can we measure something when there is no need of authorization? There are no need for anything. So this free flow is interesting. It is useful, but then on the other side, it's hard to quantify. Therefore, indeed, if I were to summarize, the first immediate impact is that it has been warmly welcomed by both sides and also by all existing stakeholders. Indeed, I also subscribe to what Bruno said about a key message. Indeed, when Commissioner McGrath was there, as the political face of the Commission, the adequacy and the mutual adequacy decisions symbolize that in today's geopolitical situation, it is important to engage, it is important to break down barriers, especially digital barriers, based on trust. So this is quite important to mention. Otherwise, when it comes to more specifically, I think I now address the question by our Paraguayan colleague. Indeed, there has been discussion with Colombia, there is ongoing discussion with Chile. Of course, none are as advanced as it was with Brazil towards the end, but there are some Latin American countries with whom the Commission is dialoguing. Of course, it's still at a very early stage, and the basis is always whether there is an independent authority, and then things go more in detail. With regards to Paraguay, I think if we can exchange also with the colleague later on bilaterally, from what I remember, there is nothing yet concrete with Paraguay. And if I were also to broaden this more than the Mercosur, a lead third country currently in discussion with the Commission is Kenya, which is also interesting because it would be the first African country, which would bring also another networking contribution. But again, it is still work in progress. But if I were to make an assessment on where we are at this stage, it would be Kenya, which is closest, while other Latin American countries with whom we are still discussing. I had myself a call with Colombia a couple of weeks ago, which I understand now are during election period, so the parliament is in recession. But I will also have a look at Paraguay, and I'm open to continue discussing also with your colleague and also to share my details so that we can also see and take stock after this call. So from my side at this moment, this is all, and it's always interesting just to follow you, and whenever you need, I'm here.
Thank you very much, David. Okay, I think this was actually I was going to jump to a question on Mercosur, so I think this was a good point. Please, Claudia.
Maybe before we jump to the next topic, just to emphasize and to encourage to continue with the efforts with the other countries, as has been said about Paraguay or other Latin American countries, because talking about our companies, the German companies that are for many years here in Brazil, I don't know, SAP, how long have you been here?
30 years.
30 years, and they are actually Brazilian companies, and since Brazil is a big gateway to do business in the rest of Latin America, it would be really important to advance with other countries that don't have adequate decisions yet, because you still have to separate within your day-to-day business if you're dealing with Brazil or with a country that has adequate decisions or doesn't have. So you still have the bureaucracy that for SMEs is significant to separate these issues, and therefore encouraging both sides to continue from the side from the EU, but also from the Brazilian side, to further this network of countries that are within that adequacy range. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much, Claudia. And I think a point I'd like to make is that, as I mentioned in our regulation, we clarify that we wish to prioritize countries where there are mutual gains to be had, right? Where there is reciprocity, where we feel that the adequacy decision can also promote greater trade benefits and so on. So we are actually at this point at ANPD working on criteria to help us prioritize countries to be considered for adequacy decisions. Because sometimes some countries will come to us and then we look at them and they're not really huge trade partners. So, of course, an adequacy decision takes time. It takes resources from our team. And for us, it's always very helpful to receive input from the business community as to what the priorities are. So, as I mentioned, we have had requests for other countries to be considered adequate. And if you could come to us and say, listen, these partners are particularly strategic for such and such reasons, this would also be very helpful for us to create our own strategy in terms of prioritization. So thank you in advance.
Adding to that, I get also from companies the interest to invest in not only one country, even if it's as big as Brazil, but to invest in a group of countries or a region, because some investments make sense only at large scale. So to have the whole Mercosur region be part of this mutual data flow, that makes, in my view, a lot of sense, also with a view to the data economy gaining pace in all of Mercosur countries, but of course also in the EU. And I think each single country in the region would benefit from being part of a larger area of free data flows. And we will try to be bridges towards DG Just. David already offered himself, but we will also reinforce that. And whenever you have the right contacts to put forward, we will do our own part. Thank you.
Yeah, just to react in some previous reflections, if the SMEs are not like so quite well awareness about this issue, for sure there are the most benefited economic agents with regard that matters. I'm also a lawyer and I'm receiving like several consultations in terms of data protection matters, and one like funny of this issue, when the adequacy decision came out, one of the clients asked me, so what I have to do right now? Nothing. You can do it. You don't have to adopt a standard clause or whatever. And the client, should I have paid for you something? No, you don't need a lawyer for it. But that is like how much impactful are those for especially SMEs. And I remember when we are discussing the text of the Brazilian data protection law, we were stronger in the sense that Brazil should adopt some kind of gold standard in comparison to other jurisdictions, because that would be an investment in a long term for our SMEs. Otherwise, we are not going to reach out that kind of decision that facilitates this specific small size of economic agent. So at the end of the day, it's also to break the barriers of entry in somehow interactions. And the second issue that I'd like to highlight, we are at the Privacy Brazil, we are following the evolution of data protection laws around the world, specifically in the Global South. And one specific pattern that is always a challenge for us is when we pass a comprehensive data protection law, we also to have built an independent oversight. That was basically the trailer, the Brazilian move in that way. We were able to pass the comprehensive data protection law, but it takes time for build an independent authority. Miriam Wimmer highlight this. At the beginning, the Brazilian Data Protection Authority was somehow an office alongside the Brazilian presidency, which is not the good architecture, because we should have independent authorities, because it's a matter of a state policy, not a government policy. So we could see in the region that kind of the partner. So I would advise to keep that in mind, not only legalist formal language, but also the institutional capacity. One thing that the European Union highlighted in decision was the increasing path of the Brazilian Data Protection Authority budget in order to make effective enforcement. That is key, because as Miriam Wimmer highlighted before, how we are going to be able to analyze other adequacy decisions if the Brazilian Data Protection Authority does not have enough budget in order to do it. So that would my takeaway as well.
Thank you very much, Bruno. We don't have a lot of time, but I would just like to pose a question. If you have wish to answer, please feel free. Otherwise, you can reflect on it and bring it afterwards. Sure.
Sorry for asking another question. I became even more curious about your other point that I forgot. If we want to move forward and have this kind of level of trust partner, we have two ways maybe to deal the matter with directly EU or even with Brazil, because you said that Argentina, Brazil, so it means that the idea is behind it that we can try to share their advances with another members, and with the result will be the same or not, or we have to deal this matter directly with EU, which is the way, the shortest way, and that we can be at the more or less at your level. Because you talk that you are doing elaborating a criteria and the second question is if the content of the Acuerdo de Adecuación de Dados is more or less public or is protected somehow.
If I may go first, thank you very much for your question and for your interest. So just to clarify, in the case of Brazil, we have our own procedure for recognizing another country as adequate, and the recognition of countries that Europe sees as adequate is not automatic, but it sort of counts points. So now that we are looking at new countries to consider for adequacy decisions, of course it's much easier if they already have a European adequacy decision, because it's as if the analysis is already halfway done. We have to look only at residual aspects that are not covered by the European decision that may be applicable in our own case. So in the case of data transfers between Brazil and Paraguay, a separate adequacy decision would have to be found. The counterpart here in Brazil is ANPD, the National Data Protection Authority. And the process would then be that we would begin negotiations. We would probably send you questions. We'd have to assess if you have an independent data protection authority, what sort of institutional safeguards you are. if your legislation is substantially similar to our own. And then at the end of this process, if all goes well, we would issue a resolution by ANPD Board of Directors, so this is an act taken by ANPD, saying that for legal purposes, data can be transferred to Paraguay without any further formalities. So this process is separate from the European process, which David can perhaps explain in more detail. But as he mentioned, and Dolores also, we do see that there is sort of a network effect, simply because it represents that there are already many commonalities and many similar aspects when we look at these countries that are, you know, reciprocally considered adequate. But perhaps David can provide more information on his own side.
Yes. So when it comes to an adequacy decision, the first step is to look into Article 45 of the GDPR. In Article 45 of the GDPR, you have what I mentioned at the beginning, constitutional requirements. Therefore, the third country has to have a rule of law, fundamental rights. It's also very important that there is an independent data protection authority. So these are the first guidance which the GDPR applies. But then indeed, after that, there will be a set of questions, a thorough analysis of the case law. We will look at the constitutional law, we will look at the data protection law, we will look at the definitions, at the concepts. We'll also look at what redress has there, what happens to the data when it's transferred from the EU, let's say to Paraguay, and Paraguay to another third country. So there is access by law enforcement, processing of personal data for national security. So the engagement is quite long. So indeed, the end benefit is great because we are equivalent, but to reach there are a number of legal assessment, a thorough legal assessment based fundamentally on Article 45, which the Commission and the third country will engage together. Therefore, that's why it's very important that there is an open discussion, because it will take place between DigiJust and the National Data Protection Authority of the third country. So it is not a long process, but it's a thorough process which takes time and a lot of correspondence one side to another, so that at the end of the day, what we have is two legal orders that speak to each other based on trust, which then serves as the basis for the free flow, for the safe flow of personal data from the EU to the third country. That's more or less what takes a number of months, if not years, laid down in the GDPR.
Thank you very much, David. Okay, so I'm going to pose a question. You can reflect on it and take it home and then bring it back if you want to. If you have an answer now, please be brief. So looking at Mercosur, what sectors, areas, and existing cross-border data transfers exist or could be benefited from a broader data adequacy regime in the companies you work for, in the companies you work with, or based on your knowledge of your country's economy? If you have any insights or sectors that would make sense for us to look further, thinking of this study we're going to conduct, please let us know. If you want to talk bilaterally, I'm here. Gabriel is here as well. Otherwise, I'll just pass on. If no one wants to answer this here now, I'll just pass on the floor and then we can wrap up almost on time. Yes? Okay, so I'll just pass on the floor then to FIESP and then to Maria for the wrap-up.
Okay, I think I have some messages from this meeting today to take home. especially also when it comes to the promotion of that of these adequacy decisions within the country, within SMEs, also within European companies, but then also to have a look, the broader look of the region, and maybe one can exchange some or establish some exchange to help on that way. No, because it sounds complicated and long, honestly. I don't know how long it took between us, but I think it's worth going. And so whatever you can do to, as part in that job, to promote this partnership, this trusted partnership, and to make it work even better with less bureaucracy and more results, we are very grateful for this. So thanks for participating, all participants from near and far, from only far involved and closely involved. Thanks to everybody. I think it was very rewarding to engage with you. Thank you.
Just on behalf of FIESP, again to thank our panelists, Julia, Bruno, Director Miriam, Ambassador Marian, Maria, Dolores, and David also. So in the context of this EU-Mercosur agreement, we are very honored to be one step further discussing adequacy. And I'll get some comments from the panelists that mutual adequacy is an assessment about trust, which is very important. And it's not necessarily the same, but it's about, as Director Miriam said, substantial equivalency that we should look for to protect both people and to enhance our business. In terms of benefits, there are so many: predictability, legal certainty, and cost reduction. So now, what should be the next steps? There is potential to expand to other countries, as mentioned here, not only in the region, but even across the region. We should enhance awareness, as mentioned, boosting our strategic collaboration between Brazil and European Union. And with that, we can foster innovation based on trust. Thank you again for being here today with us.
Thank you, David. You can now go have dinner.